By sunrise in 1925, somewhere in southern Texas, the herd walked back through the gate on its own. Every head calm, every hide clean. The dog came back too, cowering low, belly to the dirt. But the man who rode out with him before dawn wasn't on the horse anymore, and the dust by the cattle gate showed cattle churn but no fresh paw prints at all. The ranch sat 6 miles east of the thorn fence that marked the edge of Baxter land, where mesquite scrub stretched gray under dry wind, and the nearest neighbor was a half-day ride through pasture that swallowed sound. It was cattle country, the kind that made men quiet and lean, where work started before light and ended after dark, and where you learned not to ask questions about what happened past the property line. The air out there tasted like dust and old leather, and in spring the wind carried the smell of thorn blossoms, sweet at first, then bitter if you breathed it too long. The thorn fence itself was older than most of the hands could remember, strung tight between cedar posts that had gone gray and hard as bone, with barbed wire looped through at intervals that caught hair and cloth if you got careless. The man's name was Hollis Wade, 31 years old, steady as fence wire, the kind you trust to work alone. He'd been at Baxter Ranch for 8 seasons, knew every gate and gully, and never missed a head count. His wife waited for him each morning in a tenant cabin near the main house, and his 2 daughters, 6 and 4, used to watch from the porch when he rode out before dawn. Hollis didn't talk much, but he whistled low when he worked, a 2-note call the cattle knew, and Spur, the ranch pit bull, followed him everywhere. The dog was 4 years old, brindle-coated, scarred along one shoulder from a run-in with a boar the year before. Spur didn't bark much, but he was good with the herd and better at keeping coyotes off the property line. Hollis had raised him from a pup, and the two moved together like they shared the same thought. On the morning it happened, Hollis rode out just before 4:30 to bring in a heifer that had strayed past the thorn fence the night before. One of the younger hands, a boy named Cleet, saw him saddle his horse by lantern light in the barn and heard him whistle once for Spur. The dog came running, collar jingling in the dark, tags clinking soft against the leather. Hollis swung into the saddle, checked the cinch with one hand, and rode east toward the fence line, where the gate chain always needed checking because cattle leaned on it when the wind turned cold. Cleet said later that Hollis looked the same as he always did. Quiet, sure, his hat pulled low, and that Spur trotted beside the horse with his ears up, the way he did when he was working. Cleet went back to mucking stalls and didn't think anything of it. Men rode out alone all the time in Texas. It was just work. By 6 o'clock, the herd walked back through the open gate on its own, every head accounted for, including the straying heifer. The horse came back too, reins loose, saddle still warm in the cold morning air. But Hollis wasn't in it, and Spur's collar hung from the top wire of the gate, leather warm to the touch, buckle unlatched, as if someone had slipped it off carefully and placed it there. The dust around the post showed cattle movement in tight circles, the kind of churn that happens when something spooks them. But there were no boot prints leading away from the gate. No paw prints either, except old ones from the day before, already half blown. The only fresh marks in the dust were hoof marks from the herd, overlapping in patterns that made no sense, like the cattle had circled the gate for minutes before finally walking through. One of the older hands, a man named Tibbs, reached for the collar and pulled his hand back fast. He said later it felt like it had been sitting in the sun all day, though the fence stood in cold shade and the morning hadn't warmed yet. He called for the foreman, a lean man named Garrity who'd been running Baxter Ranch since before Hollis ever signed on. Garrity came down from the main house with his rifle and stood at the gate for a long time without saying anything. He touched the collar once, then looked at the saddle on Hollis's horse, still holding warmth like the man had just slipped out of it. He looked at the dust, at the herd standing calm in the pasture beyond, at the gray scrub stretching east toward nothing. Within the hour, every hand on the ranch was walking the fence line with lanterns still lit against the gray dawn. They spread out in pairs, calling Hollis's name, checking behind mesquite clumps and dry gullies where a man might fall if his horse spooked. They found the gate chain clicking soft on a still wind, though there wasn't enough breeze to move it. They found Hollis's hat pressed into the dirt near the post, brim down, like someone had set it there with care. But they found no sign of Hollis, and no sign of Spur, except that collar hanging warm on the wire. Garrity sent Cleet back to tell Hollis's wife, and the boy said later that was the worst ride he ever made. She didn't cry when he told her. She just stood on the porch with her arms folded and asked if they'd checked past the fence line, out in the scrub where the land got strange. Cleet said they had. She nodded once and went back inside, and her daughters watched from the window with their faces pressed to the glass. By midday, the search had pushed a mile past the fence in every direction. They tied rag strips to the posts to mark where they'd already walked, and the strips hung limp in air that wouldn't move. The sun climbed white and hard, but the ground stayed cold underfoot, the kind of cold that doesn't belong in Texas spring. One of the hands said later that he'd heard a whistle out past the scrub line, low and two-noted, the way Hollis always called the cattle, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there except gray brush and the fence line cutting through it like a scar. Men in Texas still won't ride that stretch alone before sunrise. Some say it started that morning, when Tibbs refused to walk past the gate without another man beside him. Others say it started 3 nights later when Spur came back. It was just after midnight, when the dog slunk under the bunkhouse, belly low, eyes wide and white-rimmed in the dark. One of the hands heard him whining and came out with a lantern. Spur was pressed against the foundation, shaking, his gaze locked on the far fence line like someone stood there watching. The hand called for him, but the dog wouldn't come. He just stared east, toward the thorn fence and the open scrub beyond, and his breath came short and fast like he'd been running. There was no collar around his neck. The hand crouched low and reached for him, and Spur snapped once, not at him, but at the air beside him, like something stood there the man couldn't see. Then the dog turned and gnawed through the rope lead they'd tied him with, teeth working fast and silent, and before anyone could grab him, he'd slipped off toward the scrub and vanished into the gray. They never saw him again, and after that, hands at Baxter Ranch rode the fence in pairs and wouldn't whistle the herd in after dark. Folks in Texas say the thorn line sometimes answers a whistle with 2 notes of its own, and that if you hear it, you don't answer back. The timeline made no sense from the start. Hollis had ridden out at 4:30 in the morning, and Cleet swore he'd watched him go. Saddle cinched tight, Spur trotting beside the horse, lantern swinging from the saddle horn. By 4:45, one of the hands sleeping in the bunkhouse said he'd heard a whistle, low and clear, coming from somewhere east of the property. He didn't think much of it at the time. Hollis always whistled when he worked, but later, when they tried to piece together what happened, that whistle stuck in his mind like a splinter. It had come from the direction of the thorn fence, maybe a little past it, and it had the right rhythm, 2 notes, short and steady, but something about it hadn't sounded quite right. He couldn't say what, just that it felt wrong in a way he didn't have words for. By 5:15, another hand named Drummond, who'd been checking water troughs near the south pasture, said he'd heard the same whistle again. This time it came from the west near the barn, which made no sense at all because Hollis had ridden east and there was no reason for him to double back without bringing the herd. Drummond said he'd turned to look, but he didn't see anyone, just the barn standing dark and the wind moving through the mesquite scrub like something breathing. He went back to work and didn't mention it until later, when it mattered. By 6 o'clock, the herd came through the gate on its own, every head accounted for, Hollis's horse trailing behind, saddle still warm. Spur's collar hanging from the wire, leather warm in cold shade. No boot prints, no paw prints, just cattle churn in the dust and that gate chain clicking soft on a wind that wasn't there. Garrity organized the first search within the hour. He sent men out in pairs, each pair carrying a lantern even though the sun was up by then, and told them to walk shoulder to shoulder through the scrub east of the fence. They started at the gate and worked outward in a grid, calling Hollis's name every 50 paces. The cattle stood calm in the pasture and watched them go. Spur's collar stayed where it was, still warm to the touch even an hour later, and nobody wanted to take it down. Tibbs said it felt wrong to move it, like it was marking something they weren't supposed to disturb. So they left it hanging, and every man who walked past the gate that morning looked at it and felt the wrongness settle in his chest like cold water. They walked the scrub for miles. The ground out past the fence was hard-packed and dry, scattered with thorn brush and low mesquite that caught at their boots. They found old cattle trails cutting through in meandering lines, and they found places where the brush had been pushed aside, but none of it looked fresh. They found no boot prints, no blood, no torn cloth, no sign that Hollis had ever been out there at all. The only thing they found was a rag strip tied to a fence post 300 yards past the gate, a strip none of them remembered tying. It was knotted tight, the kind of knot Hollis used, and it was clean, like it had been put there that morning. But none of the men had been that far out yet. Garrity stared at it for a long time, then told the others to mark it and keep moving. By midday, they brought dogs out from the main house, 2 hounds that Garrity kept for tracking coyotes. The dogs picked up a scent near the gate and followed it east into the scrub, pulling hard on their leads, noses low to the ground. They tracked for maybe 200 yards and then they stopped, both of them at the same time in the same spot, like they'd hit a wall. They whined low in their throats and backed up, tails tucked, ears flat. Garrity pulled on the leads, but the dogs wouldn't go forward. One of them lay down in the dirt and started shaking. The other turned in a tight circle and pulled so hard it nearly choked itself trying to get back to the ranch. Garrity let them go, and they ran all the way back to the barn and wouldn't come out for the rest of the day. The men kept searching. They spread out wider, checking dry gullies and low spots where a man might fall if his horse threw him. They checked behind every clump of mesquite thick enough to hide a body. They walked until their boots were white with dust and their voices went hoarse from calling. By late afternoon, they'd covered 3 square miles of scrub and found nothing. No tracks, no tools, no sign of struggle. Just that one rag strip tied in Hollis's knot, and the warm collar hanging from the gate wire. That evening, back at the ranch, the older hands started talking in low voices near the bunkhouse. Tibbs told the younger ones that the land past the thorn fence had always been strange, that cattle didn't like to graze out there, and horses got skittish when you rode too far east. He said there'd been stories years back about men who'd gone out into the scrub and come back different, quiet or wrong somehow, like something had followed them home. He didn't say what kind of something, just that the older hands in Texas had learned not to ride that stretch alone, and that if you heard a whistle coming from past the fence line, you didn't answer it. You turned your horse around and you rode back, and you didn't look over your shoulder to see if anything was following. The younger hands didn't know what to make of that. They wanted to keep searching, to push farther out, to find Hollis or at least find some sign that would explain where he'd gone. But Garrity said no. He said they'd done what they could for one day, and that nobody was going back out to the scrub after dark. He posted 2 men at the gate with lanterns and told them to watch the fence line and report anything strange. Then he went to Hollis's cabin to talk to his wife, and the men saw her standing on the porch afterward with her arms folded, staring east toward the thorn fence like she was waiting for something to come back. That night, just after 10 o'clock, one of the men posted at the gate said he'd heard something, a sound like metal dragging over wire, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere past the fence. He called for his partner, and the 2 of them stood there with their lanterns raised, listening. The sound came again, a long, scraping drag, then silence. Then it came from a different direction, farther south along the fence line. Then it stopped. The men didn't leave their post, but they stood close together the rest of the night and neither of them turned their back to the scrub. By the 3rd day, the search had turned into something else. It wasn't about finding Hollis anymore. It was about proving to themselves that there was nothing out there to be afraid of. They walked the same ground they'd already covered, checking and rechecking, tying more rag strips to fence posts to mark their progress. The strips hung limp in air that wouldn't move, and by evening there were dozens of them stretching east into the scrub like a line of pale flags. But when the men came back the next morning, some of the strips were gone. Not torn down, just gone, like they'd never been tied at all. And in their place were new strips, tied in knots nobody recognized, marking spots the men hadn't reached yet. That was when the older hands in Texas told the younger ones, "You don't check that line alone anymore. You ride in pairs, you keep your eyes on each other, and if you hear a whistle coming from the scrub, you don't answer. You turn around and you ride back, and you don't stop until you're past the gate." By the end of the first week, the search had become a ritual. Every morning before dawn, the hands gathered at the gate with lanterns and walked the same grid they'd walked the day before, checking the same ground, calling the same name. They tied fresh rag strips to the fence posts to replace the ones that had vanished overnight, and they marked their progress with chalk on the gate itself, lines and numbers that meant something only to them. The women brought food down from the main house and waited on the porch while the men searched, and Hollis's wife stood with them, silent, watching the scrub, like she could see through it to whatever lay beyond. Garrity brought in men from neighboring ranches to help with the search. They came with horses and dogs and dragged hooks for checking the dry gullies where water sometimes pooled after rain. They worked in lines, shoulder to shoulder, combing through mesquite and thorn brush until their hands were cut and their clothes were torn. They found nothing. No body. No blood. No tools or torn cloth or anything that would explain where Hollis had gone. The only thing they kept finding were those rag strips. The ones that appeared overnight in places they hadn't marked, tied in knots that didn't match the ones they'd used. Some of the strips were knotted the way Hollis used to knot them, tight and clean with the tail tucked under, and that was worse than finding nothing at all. On the 8th day, one of the younger hands named Mercer was walking the fence line alone, against orders, but he'd wanted to prove he wasn't afraid, when he found something in the dirt near the gate. It was a scrap of paper, folded once, tucked under a rock that hadn't been there the day before. He picked it up and unfolded it, and his hands started shaking. The paper had 3 words written on it in pencil, blocky and careful. "Check the fence." He brought it back to Garrity, and the foreman held it up to the light and stared at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he called for Tibbs, and Tibbs looked at the handwriting and nodded once. It was Hollis's hand. Tibbs had seen it 100 times in the ranch ledger, in supply lists and gate tallies and notes left on the bunkhouse door. There was no mistaking it, but the paper was clean, the pencil marks sharp and fresh, and nobody could say where it had come from or how it had gotten there. The rock it had been tucked under was smooth and round, the kind you'd find in a riverbed, but the nearest river was 20 miles south, and there was no reason for a rock like that to be sitting by the gate. Garrity told the men to check the fence again, every post and every wire, from the gate all the way to the property line and back. They walked it twice, looking for breaks or bent wire or anything that might explain what Hollis had meant. They found nothing wrong. The fence was solid, strung tight, posts sunk deep and straight. But when they came back to the gate that evening, Spur's collar was gone. It had been hanging on the top wire for 8 days, warm to the touch every time someone checked it. And now it was gone. The wire where it had hung was still warm, like the leather had just been lifted away. But there were no boot prints in the dust below, and no sign that anyone had come near the gate all day. That night, some of the hands started talking about leaving. They said the search was over, that Hollis was gone and whatever had taken him wasn't going to give him back. They said the land past the fence was wrong, that it had always been wrong, and that men who kept pushing into it came back changed or didn't come back at all. Tibbs told them to keep their voices down, that talk like that would spook the others, but he didn't argue with them. He just sat on the bunkhouse steps with his head in his hands and didn't say anything for a long time. The theories came slow at first, then all at once. Some said Hollis had enemies, that maybe someone had followed him out to the scrub and done something the law wouldn't want to hear about. Others said he'd gotten thrown from his horse and was lying hurt somewhere they hadn't checked yet, that the scrub was bigger than they thought and the search hadn't gone far enough. A few of the older hands said the land out past the thorn fence never gave back what it took, that there were places in Texas where the ground swallowed men whole and left no trace, and that Hollis had ridden into one of those places and wasn't coming out. And then there were the ones who didn't say anything at all, the ones who'd heard the whistle coming from 2 directions at once, who'd seen the rag strips appear in places they hadn't marked, who'd touched Spur's collar and felt the wrongness of it burn through their palms. They didn't need theories. They just knew. On the 10th day, Hollis's wife came down to the gate herself. She stood there with her daughters beside her, all 3 of them silent, staring out at the scrub like they were waiting for something to move. Garrity tried to tell her to go back to the cabin, that there was nothing to see, but she didn't listen. She just stood there for an hour, maybe more, and then she bent down and picked up something from the dirt near the post. It was Spur's collar. The leather was still warm, the buckle unlatched, just like it had been the morning Hollis disappeared. But it hadn't been there 10 minutes before, when the men had checked the gate. It had appeared while she was standing there, while a dozen hands were watching the fence line and nobody had seen it happen. She held the collar in both hands and looked at Garrity, and he saw something in her face that made him take a step back. She didn't cry. She just folded the collar into her apron pocket and walked back to the cabin with her daughters trailing behind, and nobody at Baxter Ranch ever saw her at the gate again. After that week, nobody in Texas took that road alone before dawn. The hands who stayed at Baxter Ranch started riding the fence in pairs, always, even in full daylight. They stopped whistling when they worked the herd near the thorn fence, and they told the new hands, the ones who came later after the story had already started to spread, that you don't answer if you hear a whistle coming from the scrub. You turn your horse around and you ride back, and you don't stop until you're past the gate. Not then. Not now. The collar stayed in Hollis's cabin for a while, tucked in a drawer his wife wouldn't open. Then one morning it was gone again. Nobody asked where. And 3 months later, when a new hand was checking the fence line at dawn, he found it hanging from the same wire where it had been the morning Hollis disappeared. Still warm, still unlatched, and when he reached for it, his hand pulled back fast, and he rode back to the bunkhouse and told Garrity he was leaving. He packed his gear that afternoon and never came back to Texas. The years passed the way years do in cattle country, slow, hard, and without much talk. Hollis Wade's name stopped appearing in the ranch ledger after the first month, and his wife moved back east with her daughters sometime before winter. The cabin they'd lived in stayed empty for a season, then got torn down and rebuilt as a storage shed. The new hands who came to work at Baxter Ranch didn't know about Hollis, not at first, but they learned soon enough. They learned from the older hands, who told them on their first week, "You ride the east fence in pairs, never alone, and if you hear a whistle coming from the scrub, you don't answer it. You turn your horse around and you ride back." That was the rule. Nobody explained why. They just said it was the rule, and the new hands followed it because the way the older hands said it made it clear you didn't ask questions. By 1930, the story had spread to neighboring ranches. Men who'd worked at Baxter and moved on told the story at bunkhouses and cattle drives, always in low voices, always after dark. They talked about the warm collar hanging from the wire, about the rag strips that appeared overnight in places nobody had marked, about the dogs that refused to track past a certain point in the scrub. They talked about the note in Hollis's handwriting that appeared 8 days after he disappeared, and about how his wife had found the collar again in the dirt while a dozen men were watching, and nobody had seen it fall. They didn't call it a ghost story, they just called it what happened at Baxter Ranch in 1925, and they left it at that. The thorn fence stayed where it was, strung tight between gray cedar posts, and the gate with the clicking chain stayed in use because there was no good reason to move it. But the hands at Baxter Ranch started checking it in pairs always, even in full daylight. They'd ride out together before dawn, one man opening the gate while the other watched the scrub, and they'd move the herd through fast and latch the chain behind them without looking back. If the chain started clicking on a still wind, they didn't stop to check it. They just kept riding until they were past the property line and into open pasture where the ground felt normal again. In 1933, Garrity retired and sold his share of the ranch to a man named Bowden who'd come up from Louisiana and didn't know the stories. Bowden heard about Hollis Wade from Tibbs, who was still working the ranch and still refused to ride the east fence alone, but Bowden didn't put much stock in it. He said men disappeared all the time in ranch country, that it was usually drink or debt or a woman, and that ghost stories didn't move cattle or fix fence. He rode out to the thorn fence alone one morning to prove his point, and he came back an hour later with his face white and his hand shaking. He wouldn't say what he'd seen or heard, but after that day he followed the same rule as everyone else. 2 men, never one, and you don't answer if you hear a whistle. By 1940, the story had become part of the landscape. Parents in the small towns around Baxter Ranch told their children not to wander too far east, not to go past the old thorn fence where the scrub stretched gray and empty. They didn't explain why. They just said it wasn't safe, and the children obeyed because they could hear the weight in their parents' voices. The older folks, the ones who remembered 1925, still talked about Hollis Wade sometimes, usually in the winter when the work was slow and the nights were long. They talked about how steady he'd been, how he'd never missed a head count, how his wife had stood at the gate with his dog's collar in her hands and known he wasn't coming back. They talked about the note he'd left, or the note someone had left in his handwriting, and about how the collar kept reappearing on the fence wire no matter how many times it was taken down. And then, in the spring of 1947, a boy who was helping his father move cattle near the east fence found something in the dirt by the gate. It was a dog collar, leather cracked and faded but still whole, buckle unlatched and hanging loose. The boy picked it up and felt the warmth in it, felt it pulse in his hands like something alive, and he dropped it fast and backed away. His father came over and looked at the collar, and his face went tight. He told the boy to leave it where it was, and they rode back to the ranch without finishing the job. That evening, the father went to the main house and told Bowden what they'd found, and Bowden walked down to the gate with a lantern and stood there for a long time, staring at the collar lying in the dust. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it. And then he walked back and told the hands that nobody was to go near the east fence alone anymore. Not for any reason. Not ever. The collar stayed in the dirt for 3 days and then it was gone. Nobody took it. It just vanished, the way it had before, and the spot where it had been was still warm when one of the hands checked it the next morning. After that, people in Texas stopped talking about Hollis Wade by name. They just talked about the east fence, about the rule, about the whistle you don't answer, and the stretch of scrub you don't ride through alone. The story became a warning, passed down from old hands to new ones, from fathers to sons, from one generation to the next. Some said Hollis had enemies, that someone had followed him out to the scrub and done something the law never found out about. Others said he'd fallen from his horse and died out in the brush where the search parties couldn't reach, that his body was still out there somewhere, buried under mesquite and thorn. A few said the land past the fence had always been strange, that it took things and didn't give them back, and that Hollis had ridden into a place where men weren't supposed to go. And then there were the ones who didn't say anything at all, the ones who'd touched the collar and felt the warmth in it, who'd heard the whistle coming from 2 directions at once, who'd seen the rag strips appear in the dust where no one had walked. They didn't need theories. They just followed the rule, and they made sure everyone else did too. Even now, people in Texas still tell the story around Baxter Ranch. They tell it to new hands on their first week, to children who ask why they can't play near the thorn fence, to anyone who wonders why the east gate is always checked in pairs. They don't call it a ghost story. They just say it's what happened in 1925, and that the rule exists for a reason. 2 men, never one. You don't answer the whistle. You don't turn your back on the scrub. And if you find a dog collar lying in the dirt near that gate, still warm after all these years, you leave it where it is and you walk away. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Texas dares to say out loud? What detail in this story should not exist in a normal world? And why do people around Baxter Ranch still follow the rule, even now, 100 years later? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.